Sometimes helping a stranger is the most dangerous thing you can do. In a world where kindness is seen as weakness, one cowboy is about to pay the ultimate price for doing what's right. Jericho Wade thought he was just helping an injured old woman in the dusty streets of Elkhorn Ridge. He had no idea she was the former mayor's mother. He had no idea the current mayor had declared her an enemy. Now the whole town wants him dead for choosing compassion over politics. They're building a gallows. They're preparing the noose. They say he's a traitor for helping the wrong person. But as his execution draws near, buried secrets start coming to light. The woman he saved holds dangerous truths about the town's past and Jericho's own mysterious history. Will these secrets save his life or seal his fate? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Elkhorn Ridge, painting the weathered wooden buildings in shades of amber and gold. Dust motes danced in the light, streaming through the windows of Murphy's General Store, where old-timers gathered each morning to share coffee and complaints about how the world was changing too fast for decent folk to keep up. Jericho Wade sat alone at a corner table in Maria Santos's cantina, nursing a cup of black coffee that had grown cold an hour ago. His weathered hands, scarred from years of hard work and harder choices, wrapped around the ceramic mug as if drawing warmth from something that had none left to give. At 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, Jericho commanded attention without seeking it. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver, fell just past his collar, and his eyes, the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes, held secrets that ran deeper than the nearby canyon. He'd been in Elkhorn Ridge for 3 months now, ever since his horse had thrown a shoe and stranded him in this particular corner of nowhere. What started as a temporary stop had stretched into something resembling permanence, though Jericho wasn't a man who believed in putting down roots. Roots meant responsibility, and responsibility meant people could get hurt when the past came calling. The cantina's heavy wooden door creaked open, and Maria Santos herself emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. At 52, Maria possessed the kind of beauty that came from within. Laugh lines around warm brown eyes, silver threading through her black hair, and a smile that could make the loneliest soul feel welcome. She'd inherited the cantina from her late husband and ran it with the efficiency of a woman who understood that feeding people was about more than just food. "You're going to wear a hole in that cup if you keep staring at it," Maria said, settling into the chair across from Jericho. Her voice carried the musical accent of her Mexican heritage, softened by decades in this dusty American town. Jericho looked up, managing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just thinking. Dangerous habit for a man like you." Maria's tone was gentle, but her gaze was sharp. She'd seen enough men carrying heavy burdens to recognize the weight Jericho bore. "Want to talk about what's got you so troubled?" Before Jericho could answer, the cantina door burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. Mayor Vernon Cross strode in like he owned not just the building but everyone in it. Cross was a man who'd never met a mirror he didn't like, every silver hair perfectly in place, his mustache waxed to sharp points, his black suit pressed to crisp perfection despite the morning heat. He carried himself with the bearing of someone who believed his own importance, which in Jericho's experience was usually a sign of a man with something to prove. "Mrs. Santos," Cross announced, his voice carrying the practiced volume of a politician addressing a crowd. "I trust you've given consideration to my generous offer for this property." Maria's spine straightened, and her warm demeanor cooled several degrees. "As I told you last week, Mr. Cross, the cantina isn't for sale." Cross's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his pale blue eyes. "Now, Maria, may I call you Maria? We both know this establishment has seen better days. The railroad's coming through, and when it does, this whole district will be transformed. Progress waits for no one. The railroad," Maria repeated, her voice flat. "Funny how that railroad keeps changing its route depending on which properties you're trying to buy. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cross's gaze shifted to Jericho, sizing him up like a rancher evaluating livestock. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Vernon Cross, mayor of this fine town." He extended a manicured hand that Jericho ignored. Jericho Wade. The name came out low and measured, carrying just enough edge to let Cross know he wasn't impressed by titles or handshakes. Ah, yes, the mysterious stranger who appeared in our midst like smoke on the wind. Cross's smile turned predatory. "Tell me, Mr. Wade, what brings a man of your capabilities to a quiet town like Elkhorn Ridge?" Horse threw a shoe. Jericho's response was deliberately simple, but his eyes never left Cross's face. "How fortunate for us." Cross straightened his coat with a sharp tug. "Well, Mrs. Santos, I'll leave you to consider my offer. Change is coming whether we embrace it or not. Those who adapt will prosper. Those who resist—" He let the threat hang in the air like smoke from a dying fire. After Cross left, Maria sat in silence for a long moment, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "That man," she said finally, "is going to destroy this town if someone doesn't stop him. How long has he been mayor?" Jericho asked. 8 months. He arrived last winter right after Mayor Fairmont took ill. Convinced enough people that new leadership was needed, that the old ways were holding us back. Maria's voice carried the bitterness of someone who'd watched her community transform into something she no longer recognized. Richard Fairmont had been mayor for 15 years. Good man, fair man. Built this town into something we could all be proud of. What happened to him? Died in his sleep, they said. Doctor called it a weak heart, but Richard Fairmont was strong as an ox until Cross showed up. Maria shook her head. His wife, Adelaide, she tried to contest the election, said there were irregularities. Cross had her declared mentally unstable, claimed grief had affected her judgment. The name Adelaide sparked something in Jericho's memory. A fragment of a conversation overheard. A glimpse of an elderly woman hurrying through back alleys, avoiding the main streets. He'd noticed her several times over the past weeks, always alone, always looking over her shoulder like someone expecting trouble. Where is she now? Mrs. Fairmont lives in a little house on the edge of town. Cross cut off her widow's pension, claimed the town couldn't afford it. Some of us help when we can, but Maria's voice trailed off. People are scared. Cross has a way of making life difficult for those who oppose him. Through the cantina's front window, Jericho could see the bustling main street of Elkhorn Ridge. On the surface, it looked like any other frontier town, merchants sweeping their storefronts, children chasing each other between the buildings, horses tied to hitching posts while their riders conducted business. But underneath the normal rhythm of daily life, Jericho sensed an undercurrent of tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. The town had grown up around a natural spring that provided water year-round, making it a vital stop for travelers and a logical place for settlers to put down roots. The buildings were a mixture of rough-hewn log structures from the early days and newer clapboard constructions that spoke of prosperity and growth. The church steeple rose above it all, a white wooden finger pointing toward heaven, though Jericho wondered how much praying was getting done in a town where the mayor made his own rules. Dr. Harrison's office occupied a tidy building near the center of town, marked by a simple wooden sign that had weathered many seasons. Doc Harrison himself was a rarity in these parts, a university-educated man who could have made his fortune in San Francisco or Denver, but chose instead to tend to the needs of common folk. Jericho had met him briefly when a bar fight had left one of Maria's customers with a knife wound. The doctor was quiet, competent, and possessed the kind of integrity that seemed increasingly rare in positions of authority. The general store was run by the Murphy family, Irish immigrants, who'd arrived with nothing but determination and had built a thriving business through honest dealing and fair prices. Their red-headed children could be seen racing through the streets at all hours, adding life and laughter to a town that sometimes forgot how to smile. But it was the people Cross had brought with him that changed the feel of Elkhorn Ridge. Strangers with hard eyes and expensive clothes, Men who wore their guns like jewelry and looked at the townspeople like wolves, sizing up sheep. They claimed to be investors and businessmen, but Jericho recognized their type. Opportunists who followed power like buzzards followed dying cattle. As the afternoon wore on, Jericho found himself walking the streets, observing the subtle signs of a community under strain. Conversations that stopped when strangers approached. Glances over shoulders. The way people hurried their business and avoided lingering in groups. These were symptoms of a town that had learned to be afraid. Near the edge of town, where the neat rows of buildings gave way to scattered houses and kitchen gardens, Jericho spotted her, an elderly woman bent over a small vegetable patch, her movements careful and deliberate, despite her obvious frailty. Adelaide Fairmont was smaller than he'd expected, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that spoke of inner strength. Her grey hair was pinned back in a practical bun, and her simple dress had been mended more than once. Though her hands were gentle as she tended to the struggling plants, something made her look up as he approached, some instinct honed by months of looking over her shoulder. Their eyes met across the small garden, and Jericho saw recognition flicker in her gaze, though he was certain they'd never been formally introduced. "You're the one who's been staying at Maria's place," she said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of an educated woman. "Jericho Wade." "Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Fairmont, isn't it?" A shadow crossed her weathered features. "I'm surprised anyone remembers that name anymore. Most folks seem to have forgotten I ever existed." "Sometimes forgetting is just another kind of remembering," Jericho said quietly. "People remember you, Mrs. Fairmont. They just don't know how to show it." Adelaide studied his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read character in a glance. "You're not what you appear to be, are you, Mr. Wade?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Jericho had spent years perfecting the art of being unremarkable, of sliding through life without leaving ripples. But something about this woman's directness cut through. His carefully constructed defenses. "None of us are," he said. Finally, Adelaide nodded as if his answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. She reached into her pocket and withdrew something small and metallic, an ornate silver locket that caught the afternoon light. "My late husband gave this to me on our wedding day. Inside is a photograph from the founding of Elkhorn Ridge. Sometimes the past has a way of becoming the future, don't you think?" Before Jericho could respond, she tucked the locket away and turned back to her garden. "Good day, Mr. Wade. I suspect we'll be seeing more of each other soon." As Jericho walked back toward town, he couldn't shake the feeling that the elderly woman knew more about his presence in Elkhorn Ridge than she was letting on. The locket had seemed significant somehow, though he couldn't say why. There were currents running beneath the surface of this conversation, depths he couldn't quite fathom. The sun was setting by the time he returned to Maria's cantina, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him of other sunsets in other places, most of which he'd rather forget. Maria was cleaning glasses behind the bar, her movements automatic and soothing, when the cantina door opened to admit Dr. Harrison. The doctor was a man in his 60s, his grey beard neatly trimmed and his clothes practical but well-maintained. He moved with the careful efficiency of someone accustomed to emergencies, but tonight there was something troubled in his expression. "Evening, Doc," Maria called. "Coffee?" "Please." Harrison settled onto a stool at the bar, nodding to Jericho. "Heard you met Adelaide Fairmont today?" "Word travels fast in a small town," Jericho observed. "Faster than you might think," Harrison replied. "Especially when Mayor Cross has eyes and ears everywhere." He accepted the coffee Maria offered with a grateful nod. "Adelaide's a remarkable woman. Her husband was my closest friend, and watching what's happened to her since his death," the doctor's voice trailed off. "You don't believe he died of natural causes," Jericho said. It wasn't a question. Harrison's hand stilled on his coffee cup. "Richard Fairmont was in perfect health. I'd examined him just 2 weeks before his death. Strong heart, clear lungs, sharp mind. Then suddenly—" He shook his head. "But proving suspicions and voicing them are two different things." especially when the man you suspect now controls the town. The cantina fell silent except for the soft crackle of the fire in the corner hearth. Outside, Elkhorn Ridge was settling into evening routines. Lamps being lit in windows, families gathering for supper, the honest rhythm of a community at rest. But beneath that peaceful facade, Jericho could feel the tension that had taken root like a weed choking a garden. "Change is coming," he said, echoing Cross's earlier words but with a different meaning entirely. "The question," Dr. Harrison replied, "is whether it will be the kind of change that builds or the kind that destroys." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hammering drifted through the cantina's windows, rhythmic, deliberate, ominous. Maria moved to peer outside, her face going pale in the lamplight. "They're building something in the town square," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Looks like a gallows." The hammering continued long into the night, each blow echoing through the darkened streets of Elkhorn Ridge like a heartbeat, counting down to something terrible. And in his room above the cantina, Jericho Wade lay awake listening to that sound and remembering other times, other places, when justice had worn the face of vengeance and mercy had been a luxury good men couldn't afford. Tomorrow would bring change, all right. The only question was whether anyone would survive it. The next morning dawned grey and oppressive, with heavy clouds that seemed to press down on Elkhorn Ridge like a lid on a coffin. Jericho had slept poorly, haunted by the rhythmic hammering that had continued well past midnight. When he finally gave up on rest and made his way downstairs, Maria was already in the kitchen, her movements sharp and agitated as she prepared breakfast. "They finished it," she said without preamble. Not looking up from the eggs she was scrambling with unnecessary force. "The gallows. Right there in the town square where everyone has to see it." Jericho poured himself coffee and moved to the window. In the grey morning light, the wooden structure looked like a skeleton against the sky. Crossbeam, platform, and the terrible dangling rope that swayed gently in the breeze. A crowd had already gathered around it, townspeople speaking in hushed voices, while Mayor Cross stood nearby with several of his men, accepting congratulations as if he'd built something to be proud of. "Who's it for?" Jericho asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Cross claims there's been too much lawlessness lately. Says it's time to send a message about justice and order." Maria's laugh held no humor. "Funny how his idea of justice always seems to benefit him." Jericho was still studying the gallows when he saw her, Adelaide Fairmont, moving slowly down Main Street with the careful steps of someone whose body no longer obeyed as readily as it once had. She carried a small basket over her arm and kept her head down, trying to pass unnoticed through the crowd. But Mayor Cross had spotted her too. Well, Cross's voice carried clearly across the square. "Look who's decided to grace us with her presence." The widow Fairmont, still clinging to yesterday's glories. Adelaide paused, her shoulders stiffening, but she didn't respond to the taunt. She continued walking, her dignity intact despite the whispers that followed in her wake. Jericho watched Cross's face twist with irritation at being ignored, saw the mayor gesture to one of his men, a lean, sharp-faced individual who wore his gun low on his hip like a professional. The man stepped into Adelaide's path, deliberately blocking her way. "Ma'am, the mayor's speaking to you. Wouldn't want folks thinking you're too good to acknowledge your betters. Please," Adelaide said quietly. "I just want to pass. Maybe you didn't hear him," the gunman continued, his voice growing louder, drawing more attention from the crowd. "The mayor was being friendly and you're being rude." Jericho found himself moving before he'd made a conscious decision. His coffee cup hit the table with enough force to slosh the contents, and he was through the cantina door before Maria could call after him. The morning air was thick with the promise of rain, and his boots made soft sounds on the packed earth as he crossed the street. "Problem here?" Jericho's voice was calm, conversational, but something in his tone made the gunman's hand drift toward his weapon. "No problem that concerns you, stranger," the man replied. "Just having a conversation with the lady. Looks more like harassment to me." Jericho stepped closer, positioning himself between Adelaide and the gunman. Maybe it's time for that conversation to end. The square had gone quiet, all eyes focused on the confrontation. Mayor Cross watched with the calculating expression of a man seeing an opportunity fall into his lap. Adelaide looked up at Jericho with something that might have been gratitude, but also concern, as if she understood better than he did what he was walking into. "You know what? You're right," the gunman said, stepping back with a cold smile. "Conversation's over." He touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of respect. "Ma'am, stranger." As the crowd began to disperse, Adelaide touched Jericho's arm gently. "Thank you," she said, "but you shouldn't have done that. You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into." "Maybe not," Jericho replied, "but I understand right from wrong." It was then that Adelaide stumbled. Her foot caught on an uneven board in the sidewalk, and she went down hard, crying out as her ankle twisted beneath her. The basket flew from her hands, scattering vegetables and a few precious possessions across the dusty street. Among them, Jericho glimpsed torn papers, documents of some kind that Adelaide scrambled to gather, even as she winced in pain. Without hesitation, Jericho knelt beside her, his large hands gentle as he helped her sit up. Blood seeped through a tear in her dress where her knee had scraped against the rough wood, and her ankle was already beginning to swell. "Don't try to move," he said softly. "Let me take a look at that." Adelaide's eyes darted around the square, fear replacing pain, as she saw the faces watching them. "Please," she whispered, "just help me up. I need to get home." But Jericho was already examining her ankle with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd tended battlefield wounds. "It's not broken, but it's a bad sprain. You won't be walking on it for a while." He looked at the torn papers scattered around them, deed documents, he realized, though some were partially burned and all were yellowed with age. "These are important to you. More important than you know," Adelaide said, tears in her eyes as she clutched the papers to her chest. "They're all I have left of Richard, of what we built here." Jericho gathered the remaining vegetables and helped Adelaide to her feet, supporting most of her weight as she leaned against him. "Where do you live?" "I'll get you home." 2 blocks down past the church. "The little blue house with the white fence." Adelaide's voice was strained with pain and something else, urgency. "But Mr. Wade, you don't understand what you've done. Helping me, being seen with me. Mayor Cross will—" "Let me worry about Mayor Cross," Jericho said firmly. "Right now you need medical attention." As they made their slow progress down the street, Adelaide gripping his arm for support, Jericho could feel eyes following them. Word would spread quickly in a town this size, and by noon everyone would know that the mysterious stranger had publicly aided the disgraced widow. He should have cared more about the consequences. But something about Adelaide Fairmont's quiet dignity reminded him of his own. Grandmother, a woman who'd faced hardship with grace and never bent her back to bullies. The little blue house sat at the end of a tree-lined street, its white picket fence enclosing a small garden where roses struggled against the harsh frontier climate. Despite its modest size, the house had been built with care. Painted shutters, a covered porch with a swing, details that spoke of love and attention. But up close, Jericho could see the signs of neglect that came with poverty: loose boards, peeling paint, a roof that would need repair before winter. Inside, the house was clean but sparse, furnished with pieces that had seen better days, but were maintained with obvious pride. Adelaide directed him to a worn armchair by the fireplace, and he helped her settle into it, propping her injured ankle on a small stool. "There's a medicine bottle in the kitchen cupboard," she said. "Laudanum. Dr. Harrison gave it to me for the bad days." Jericho found the bottle and brought it to her along with a glass of water. As she took a careful sip of the bitter medicine, he knelt to examine her ankle more closely. The swelling was getting worse, and the discoloration suggested damage to more than just the joint. "This needs ice," he said. "And Dr. Harrison should take a look at it." "I can't afford the doctor," Adelaide replied quietly. "And after today, after what you did, Mr. Wade, Mayor Cross will use this against both of us. He's been looking for an excuse to get rid of me, and now he has one." Anyone who helps me will be painted as an enemy of progress, a threat to the town's future. What future? Jericho asked. The one where bullies run roughshod over decent people? Adelaide studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing how much to trust him. Finally, she reached into her dress pocket and withdrew the torn deed documents he'd helped her gather. "These papers," she said, "they prove that my husband didn't just serve as mayor. He founded this town. He filed the original claim, surveyed the land, established the water rights. Everything Mayor Cross is trying to sell to his railroad friends. None of it belongs to him." Jericho examined the papers carefully. Despite the damage, he could make out enough to understand their significance. Land grants, water rights, territorial agreements, all bearing the name Richard Fairmont and the official seals of the territorial government. "Why haven't you shown these to people?" he asked. "Who would believe me? Gross has convinced everyone that I'm a bitter old woman clinging to fantasy. And these papers, they were nearly destroyed in a fire at my house last month. Gross claims it was an accident, faulty chimney. But the fire started in Richard's study, where he kept all his important documents." Adelaide's voice dropped to a whisper. "I managed to save some of them, but not enough to prove everything." The sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Through the lace curtains, Jericho could see Mayor Cross riding up to the house with two of his men, their faces set in grim determination. Cross dismounted with theatrical flourish, straightening his coat and adjusting his hat before striding up the front walk. His knock on the door was sharp and demanding. "Mrs. Fairmont, open up. Official business." Adelaide's face had gone pale, and her hands trembled as she tried to hide the documents. "He's come for them," she whispered. "He knows I have proof." Jericho moved to the window, assessing their options. The house was small, with limited exits, and Cross's men had positioned themselves to cover both the front and back doors. Whatever was about to happen, there would be no running from it. "Mrs. Fairmont." Cross's voice was louder now, more insistent. "I know you're in there. We need to discuss this morning's disturbance. What do you want me to do?" Jericho asked quietly. Adelaide looked at him with eyes that held a lifetime of sorrow and a spark of something that might have been hope. "Whatever happens," she said, "don't let him destroy what's left of Richard's legacy. This town was built on principles of justice and community. Cross would turn it into nothing but a way station for his railroad friends, a place where money matters more than people." The knocking came again, harder this time, rattling the door in its frame. Mayor Cross was through with polite requests. "Mrs. Fairmont, I'm coming in. We have reports of you harboring a dangerous individual, someone who threatened one of my deputies this morning. For the safety of this community, I'm placing both of you under arrest." Adelaide reached for Jericho's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you," she said simply, "for helping a foolish old woman who should have known better than to walk through town alone." "You're not foolish," Jericho replied. "And you're not alone." The door burst open, slamming back against the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. Mayor Cross stood in the doorway like an avenging angel, his pale eyes bright with triumph and his perfectly groomed moustache twitching with satisfaction. Well, he said, stepping into the small parlor with his men flanking him. "Just as I suspected. The troublemaker and the traitor plotting together against the lawful authority of Elkhorn Ridge. Behind him, more people were gathering, townspeople drawn by curiosity or concern, watching from the street as their neighbors were accused of crimes they didn't understand. Among them, Jericho spotted Dr. Harrison and Maria Santos, their faces tight with worry. "What's the charge, Cross?" Jericho asked, rising slowly to his full height. "Disturbing the peace. Threatening a lawman. Conspiracy against the municipal government." Cross's smile was cold and satisfied. "Take your pick. I'm sure we can find something that fits." "And Mrs. Fairmont? What's her crime? Falling down in the street? Harboring a fugitive? Possession of forged documents? Mental incompetence?" Cross gestured to his men, who moved forward with handcuffs. "The widow Fairmont has been living in a fantasy world where her dead husband still matters. Time to face reality." As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, Jericho caught Adelaide's eye one last time. She nodded slightly. And he understood the real battle was just beginning, and everything that happened next would determine not just their fates, but the soul of Elkhorn Ridge itself. The Elkhorn Ridge jail was a modest affair. 3 cells built into the back of the sheriff's office, with iron bars that had seen better days, and a single window that offered a view of the alley where stray cats fought over scraps. Jericho found himself in the middle cell, while Adelaide had been placed in the one to his right, close enough that they could speak in whispers without being overheard by the deputy stationed at the front desk. Deputy Mills was a nervous young man who'd taken the job for steady pay and found himself in over his head with Mayor Cross's brand of politics. He kept glancing toward the cells as if expecting trouble, his hand never straying far from his sidearm. But it was clear that his heart wasn't in this business of arresting good people for acts of kindness. "Mrs. Fairmont," Mills said during one of his checks, his voice apologetic, "is there anything I can get you? Water? Something for the pain?" Adelaide sat on her narrow cot with her injured ankle elevated, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. "I'm fine, Deputy. Thank you for asking. This whole thing, it doesn't seem right," Mills continued, glancing toward the front office to make sure Mayor Cross wasn't within earshot. "I mean, all you did was fall down, and Mr. Wade here was just helping you up." "Sometimes helping the wrong person is considered a crime," Adelaide replied quietly, "especially when those in power decide that compassion is dangerous." Through the barred window, Jericho could see townspeople gathering in small groups, their conversations hushed but animated. Word of the arrests had spread quickly, and the community was divided in their reactions. Some nodded approvingly, convinced by Cross's rhetoric about law and order. Others shook their heads and spoke in worried whispers about neighbors being arrested for showing kindness. It was near midday when Dr. Harrison arrived, his medical bag in hand, and his face set in determined lines. He spoke briefly with Deputy Mills, and Jericho caught fragments of their conversation, something about medical necessity and humanitarian obligation. Minutes later, the doctor was being escorted to Adelaide's cell. "Mrs. Fairmont," Dr. Harrison said formally, loud enough for Mills to hear, "I'm here to examine your injuries. Deputy, I'll need privacy to conduct a proper medical assessment." Mills hesitated, clearly torn between following proper procedure and respecting the doctor's authority. I suppose that would be all right." For medical reasons. Once Mills had retreated to give them space, Dr. Harrison knelt beside Adelaide's cot and began examining her ankle. But his real purpose became clear when he spoke in barely audible tones. "Maria Santos sends her regards," he whispered. "She's organizing support among the townspeople, but carefully. Cross has eyes everywhere, and she can't afford to be arrested too." "What about the papers?" Adelaide asked, wincing as the doctor probed her swollen joint. "Safe," Harrison replied. "When Cross's men searched your house, they found the burned remnants in your fireplace, just as you planned. The real documents are hidden, where they'll never think to look." Jericho leaned closer to the bars, separating his cell from Adelaide's. "There are more papers?" Dr. Harrison glanced around, ensuring they were still unobserved. Richard Fairmont was a meticulous man. He kept copies of everything: land grants, water rights, incorporation documents. Most people don't know that Adelaide has a complete record of the town's founding hidden away. "Hidden where?" Jericho asked. Adelaide's hand moved to the small wooden cross hanging around her neck, a simple carved piece that looked like a personal memento. "My husband made this for me on our first anniversary. He was a man of faith, believed that truth and justice were sacred principles worth preserving." The cross, Jericho realized, was more than just jewelry. The way Adelaide touched it suggested significance beyond sentiment. "Cross is planning something," Dr. Harrison continued, still maintaining the pretense of examining Adelaide's injury. "He's called a town meeting for tonight. Claims he wants to address the community about the arrest, about maintaining law and order. What's he really planning?" Adelaide asked. "From what I've heard, he intends to put you both on trial. Quick justice, he calls it. Probably hopes to have this resolved before anyone can raise serious objections." The sound of approaching footsteps made them all freeze. Mayor Cross appeared at the cell block entrance, his pale eyes taking in the scene with calculating assessment. "Dr. Harrison," Cross said smoothly, "I trust your examination is proceeding satisfactorily." "Mrs. Fairmont has suffered significant trauma to her ankle," Harrison replied, his voice professionally neutral. "She requires proper medical care. How unfortunate. Perhaps she should have been more careful where she walked." Cross's smile held no warmth. "I'm sure you understand that security concerns must take precedence over comfort." Harrison finished his examination and packed his bag with deliberate care. "I'll need to return tomorrow to check on her progress. Medical necessity, of course. We're not barbarians, Doctor." Cross stepped aside to allow Harrison to pass, then moved closer to the cells. "I hope you're both comfortable. It may be your last night of peaceful rest for some time." After Cross left, the jail fell into tense silence. Adelaide lay on her cot, one hand still touching the wooden cross, while Jericho paced the confines of his cell like a caged wolf. Deputy Mills returned to his post, but his earlier nervousness had been replaced by something approaching resolve. As evening approached, the sounds of the town meeting drifted through the window, voices raised in debate, the scrape of chairs being arranged, the general murmur of a community in discussion. Jericho could imagine the scene, Cross standing before the assembled townspeople, painting himself as the defender of law and order while portraying Adelaide and Jericho as threats to public safety. "He's good at this," Adelaide said quietly, as if reading Jericho's thoughts. "Richard used to say that the most dangerous men are those who can make evil sound like righteousness." "Tell me about your husband," Jericho said. "How did he end up founding this town?" Adelaide's eyes took on a distant look, as if she were seeing into the past. "Richard was a surveyor for the territorial government, but he was also a dreamer. He believed that communities should be built on principles of mutual support and shared prosperity. When he found this valley, with its natural spring and defensible position, he saw an opportunity to create something special. What made it special? The charter, he wrote. Most frontier towns were established for profit, mining claims, railroad stops, cattle operations. But Richard designed Elkhorn Ridge as a cooperative community. Land was allocated based on need and contribution, not just ability to pay. Water rights were shared communally. Decisions were made by council vote, not by whoever had the most money. Through the window, they could hear Cross's voice rising above the crowd, his words indistinct, but his tone unmistakably persuasive. Whatever he was telling them, it was having an effect. The responsive murmur of the crowd suggested agreement, or at least acquiescence. "He's convincing them," Jericho observed. "He's frightening them," Adelaide corrected. "Fear is easier than hope, especially when people are struggling. Cross promises them prosperity if they just follow his lead, accept his authority, and what does he really offer them? Servitude. Once the railroad comes through and Cross has sold off the communal lands, the people of Elkhorn Ridge will be tenants in their own town, workers for his business partners, with no say in their own future." Deputy Mills appeared at the cell block entrance, his young face troubled. "Mrs. Fairmont, Mr. Wade, I thought you should know. The town meeting just voted. They've agreed to hold your trial tomorrow morning." "Trial?" Jericho asked. "What kind of trial?" "Mayor Cross says it's a municipal hearing. He'll serve as judge since we don't have a proper court. Says it's within his authority as mayor to handle local law enforcement matters." Adelaide sat up straighter on her cot.
"And the charges?"
Mills consulted a piece of paper with obvious reluctance. "Disturbing the peace, conspiracy against municipal authority, and—" he hesitated. "Treason against the community. Treason." Jericho's voice was dangerously quiet. "For helping an injured woman? That's what the paper says." Mills folded the document and tucked it away. "I'm sorry. I know it's not right, but Cross has the town council backing him now. Says this is about setting an example, showing that no one is above the law." After Mills left, Adelaide reached through the bars separating their cells, her weathered hand finding Jericho's. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "You came here to help a stranger, and now you're caught up in something much larger." "Maybe that's why I came," Jericho replied, surprising himself with the admission. Maybe some things are worth getting caught up in. Outside, the town meeting was breaking up, and the sounds of dispersing crowds filled the evening air. Tomorrow would bring Cross's version of justice, but tonight offered one last opportunity to hope that truth might still matter in Elkhorn Ridge. In the darkness of his cell, Jericho found himself thinking about the wooden cross Adelaide wore, about hidden documents and lost principles, about a town founded on ideals that seemed as fragile as smoke in the wind. Whatever tomorrow brought, he was beginning to understand that this fight was about more than just two people wrongly accused. It was about the soul of a community and whether good people would stand up when standing up mattered most. Dawn came too quickly, bringing with it the sound of hammering as workers made final preparations to the gallows in the town square. The rhythmic pounding seemed to echo through Jericho's bones, a countdown to something that felt increasingly inevitable. He'd spent the night awake, listening to Adelaide's quiet breathing and the nervous pacing of Deputy Mills, who seemed to understand that he was caught between duty and conscience. It was Maria Santos who arrived first that morning, carrying a basket that supposedly contained breakfast for the prisoners. Deputy Mills allowed her into the cell block with obvious relief. Anything that might ease the tension of the situation was welcome. "Buenos dias," Maria said softly, setting down the basket and moving close to the bars. "I brought coffee and fresh bread. Also something else." She glanced toward the front office, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard, then reached into the basket and withdrew an antique brass surveyor's compass. The instrument was beautifully crafted, with intricate engravings around the rim and a brass chain that spoke of both utility and significance. "This belonged to Richard Fairmont," Maria whispered, pressing the compass into Adelaide's hands. "Dr. Harrison thought you might want it with you today." Adelaide's fingers closed around the compass with reverence. "I remember when he used this to survey the original town boundaries. He said a compass always points toward truth, no matter how lost you might feel." "There's something else," Maria continued. "People are talking. Not everyone believes Cross's version of what happened yesterday. The Murphys at the general store, the Hendersons who run the livery stable, even some of Cross's own supporters are asking questions." "What kind of questions?" Jericho asked. "Why arresting two people for an act of kindness serves justice? Why the trial is being rushed through without proper legal representation? Why Cross seems so eager to silence Adelaide specifically?" Maria's voice dropped even lower. "Some of them remember Richard Fairmont. Remember what this town was like before Cross arrived." Adelaide turned the compass over in her hands, studying the engravings as if they held messages from her deceased husband. "Richard always said that communities are held together by trust, not fear. Once that trust is broken, it can be rebuilt," Maria interrupted firmly. "But only if good people are willing to stand up and speak truth." The sound of approaching voices made them all freeze. Mayor Cross was arriving with several men, their boots loud on the wooden sidewalk outside. Maria quickly returned the compass to the basket, covering it with a cloth napkin. "Time for justice," Cross announced as he entered the cell block, flanked by two armed men Jericho didn't recognize. They had the look of hired guns, hard faces, expensive weapons, and the casual arrogance of men accustomed to intimidating others. "Mrs. Santos, your charitable visit is concluded." Maria gathered her things with deliberate slowness, her dark eyes meeting Adelaide's one last time. "Vaya con Dios," she said quietly. "Both of you." After Maria left, Cross stood before their cells like a general reviewing troops. His black suit was immaculate as always, every silver hair in place. But there was something different about his demeanor this morning, a nervous energy that suggested even he wasn't entirely confident in what was about to unfold. "I trust you both slept well," Cross said with false courtesy. "Today marks an important moment for Elkhorn Ridge, a demonstration that law and order will be maintained regardless of who challenges it." "Whose law?" Adelaide asked quietly. "Whose order?" Cross's pale eyes flicked to her with annoyance. "The law of progress, Mrs. Fairmont. The order of civilization moving forward instead of wallowing in the past. Progress. Adelaide repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. Is that what you call selling off community land to railroad speculators? Turning neighbors into tenants? I call it reality. Cross's voice hardened. Your husband's quaint little experiment in frontier socialism was doomed from the start. Communities need strong leadership, clear hierarchy, efficient decision-making. Democracy is a luxury that frontier towns can't afford. Jericho had remained silent during this exchange, but now he stepped closer to the bars. Funny how your version of strong leadership seems to require silencing anyone who disagrees with you. On the contrary, Mr. Wade, today's proceedings will be entirely transparent. The whole community will witness justice being served. Cross smiled coldly. Of course, justice can take many forms. Cooperation might result in leniency. Continued defiance will bring consequences. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Cross was offering them a choice: capitulate publicly to his authority or face whatever sentence he chose to impose. Given the freshly constructed gallows, the consequences of defiance seemed clear. What kind of cooperation? Adelaide asked. Simple. Acknowledge that your husband's founding documents were irregular, possibly fraudulent. Admit that your claims about land rights and community ownership have no legal basis. Accept that the current municipal government has full authority to manage the town's assets as it sees fit, and in return, exile. You'll be escorted out of town and forbidden to return. Mr. Wade will be released with a warning about interfering in local affairs. Cross's tone suggested he considered this remarkably generous. Refuse, and face the full consequences of treason against the community. Adelaide's hand moved to the compass hidden in her dress pocket, drawing strength from its weight. My husband surveyed every inch of this valley, filed every legal document in proper order, followed territorial law to the letter. There was nothing irregular about Elkhorn Ridge's founding. Prove it, Cross snapped. Show me these documents you claim exist. They were destroyed in the fire, Adelaide replied steadily. As you well know, how convenient. The only evidence of your claims vanishes just when it might have been useful. Cross turned to Jericho. And you, Mr. Wade? Are you prepared to die for this woman's delusions? Jericho studied Cross's face, reading the desperation beneath the bluster. The mayor needed this to end quickly, before too many people started asking uncomfortable questions. I'm prepared to die for what's right, Jericho said simply. Cross's composure cracked slightly. Then you're both fools. Guards! Prepare the prisoners for transport. As they were led from their cells, Adelaide managed to whisper to Jericho. The compass points true north. Remember that. The morning sun was brutal as they emerged from the jail, hands shackled and surrounded by Cross's men. A crowd had gathered in the town square, larger than Jericho had expected, faces showing a mixture of curiosity, concern, and uncertainty. He spotted Dr. Harrison near the front, his weathered face grim with worry. Maria Santos stood with a group of Mexican families, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. The gallows loomed over it all, casting shadows across the assembled townspeople, like a reminder of what happened to those who challenged authority. Cross had arranged chairs on a platform near the scaffold, judge's bench, jury box, and execution site all within convenient proximity. Citizens of Elkhorn Ridge, Cross began, his voice carrying clearly across the square. We gather today to address a serious threat to our community's stability. These individuals stand accused of conspiracy against lawful authority, of attempting to undermine the progress and prosperity that our town deserves. As Cross spoke, Jericho noticed something that gave him hope. Not everyone in the crowd was nodding along. Questions were being whispered, doubts expressed in quiet conversations. The foundation of Cross's support wasn't as solid as it appeared. Adelaide stood straight despite her shackles and injured ankle, the compass hidden in her pocket, a reminder of true north when everything else seemed to be spinning out of control. Whatever happened next, she was determined to face it with the same dignity her husband had shown in building this community. The trial of Elkhorn Ridge was about to begin, and its outcome would determine more than just two individual fates. It would decide what kind of place the town would become, and whether the principles of justice and compassion could survive in a world increasingly dominated by fear and greed. The makeshift courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as Mayor Cross took his position behind a wooden table that served as a judge's bench. He'd arranged the proceedings with theatrical precision, himself as judge, two of his supporters as jury members, and the accused standing before the gallows, like actors in a morality play designed to demonstrate the consequences of defying authority. "This tribunal is called to order," Cross announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We are here to address charges of conspiracy, treason, and disturbing the peace against the defendants Adelaide Fairmont and Jericho Wade." Dr. Harrison stood up from the crowd, his voice clear and strong despite his age. "On what legal authority do you convene this court? By what right do you serve as judge in a matter where you are clearly the complainant?" Cross's pale eyes flicked to the doctor with irritation. "By the authority vested in me as mayor of this community, and by the emergency powers granted during times of civil unrest." "Unless you have legal credentials I'm unaware of, Dr. Harrison, I suggest you remain silent." "I have something better than legal credentials," Harrison replied, stepping forward. "I have this." From his medical bag, he withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, but its binding still intact. The crowd stirred with curiosity as Harrison held up the book for all to see. "This is Richard Fairmont's personal journal, documenting the founding of Elkhorn Ridge and the legal procedures he followed. It contains detailed records of land grants, water rights, and the original town charter." Adelaide's breath caught in her throat. She'd thought Richard's journal had been lost in the fire, but somehow Dr. Harrison had preserved it. Cross's face had gone pale beneath his carefully groomed mustache. "Where did you get that?" Cross demanded. "Richard gave it to me for safekeeping shortly before his death," Harrison replied. "He was concerned about irregularities in the town's administration. Asked me to ensure these records survived if anything happened to him." "Lies." Cross stood abruptly, his composure cracking. "That book was destroyed in the fire at the Fairmont house." "Everyone knows that. The books in Richard's study were destroyed," Harrison agreed. "But this journal was in my possession." Richard was a careful man. He knew the value of keeping important documents safe from those who might wish to destroy them. The crowd was murmuring now, excitement and confusion rippling through the assembled townspeople. Cross's supporters looked uncertain, while those who remembered Richard Fairmont with affection pressed closer to hear what the journal might reveal. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, opening the journal to a marked page, "these records show that the current mayor's election was conducted in violation of the town charter. According to the founding documents, municipal elections require a 2/3 majority of all eligible voters, not just those present at the meeting." Cross's face was reddening with anger and what looked suspiciously like panic. "This is a desperate attempt to disrupt legitimate proceedings with forged documents and false accusations." "Then you won't mind if we verify the information," Dr. Harrison said calmly. "The journal includes survey maps, property descriptions, and witness signatures. All of it can be cross-referenced with territorial records." "Enough!" Gross slammed his hand on the makeshift bench. "This tribunal is not concerned with ancient history or the fantasies of dead men. We are here to address specific charges against specific individuals." But the damage was done. The crowd's attention had shifted from the defendants to the mayor himself, and questions were being asked in increasingly loud voices. Why was Cross so opposed to examining the journal? What was he afraid they might find? If the election had been irregular, what did that mean for his authority? Adelaide stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the square despite her physical frailty. "Citizens of Elkhorn Ridge, you have the right to know the truth about your community's founding. My husband didn't just establish this town. He designed it as a place where ordinary people could build extraordinary lives together. The defendant will remain silent." Gross barked, but his authority was eroding by the minute. "Let her speak," someone called from the crowd. Jericho recognized the voice as belonging to Michael Murphy from the general store. Yes, let her speak. Others took up the cry, and Cross found himself facing something he hadn't expected, a community that wanted to hear what Adelaide Fairmont had to say. Adelaide looked out over the faces of her neighbors, people she'd known for years, some of whom had turned away from her in recent months out of fear or confusion. Richard believed that Elkhorn Ridge should belong to the people who live here, work here, raise their families here. The land grants he filed ensured that no single person could claim ownership of the entire valley. The water rights were designated as communal property. The town charter required that major decisions be made collectively, not by the whim of any individual. Pretty words, Cross interrupted desperately, but where's the proof? Where are these magical documents that supposedly make her claims legitimate? Adelaide's hand moved to the compass in her pocket and she smiled. The first genuine smile Jericho had seen from her since this ordeal began. The proof isn't magical, Mr. Cross. It's methodical, documented, and filed with the proper authorities. Richard Fairmont was a surveyor. He knew the importance of accurate records. She turned to address the crowd directly. Dr. Harrison has the journal, but there are other records as well. Copies filed with the territorial government, survey maps lodged with the land office, witness statements from the original settlers. Her voice grew stronger with each word, all of it confirming that Elkhorn Ridge was founded as a cooperative community, with land rights and governance structures designed to protect the people who call this place home. Cross was looking around frantically now, seeking support from his allies, but even they seemed shaken by the turn of events. The hired gunmen he'd brought were tense, hands near their weapons, but uncertain about what their role should be in this increasingly chaotic situation. "This is all irrelevant," Cross shouted, trying to regain control. "Whatever documents may or may not exist, these defendants are charged with specific crimes committed yesterday. Mrs. Fairmont harbored an individual who threatened a lawman. Mr. Wade assaulted a deputy in the performance of his duties. I helped an injured woman," Jericho said quietly, but his voice carried in the sudden silence. "If that's a crime in Elkhorn Ridge, then this town has lost its way. You interfered with official business." Cross accused. "I saw a man intimidating an elderly woman who'd fallen and hurt herself." "If your deputy was conducting official business, then your definition of law enforcement needs examining." Dr. Harrison raised the journal again. "According to Richard Fairmont's notes, the original town charter specifically protects the right of any citizen to render aid to others in distress. It's written into the founding documents as a core principle of the community." The crowd was becoming restless, voices raised in heated discussion. Some still supported Cross, convinced by his promises of prosperity and progress. But others were beginning to remember what Elkhorn Ridge had been like under Richard Fairmont's leadership, a place where neighbors looked out for each other, where decisions were made openly, where justice meant something more than the will of whoever held power. Cross realized he was losing control of the situation and made a desperate decision. "Guards, arrest Dr. Harrison for contempt of court and possession of stolen documents." But as his men moved forward, something unexpected happened. Maria Santos stepped between them and the doctor, her arms spread wide in protection. "No," she said simply. "Enough." Behind her, other townspeople began to move. The Murphys, the Hendersons, families that had been part of Elkhorn Ridge since its early days. They formed a loose circle around Dr. Harrison, not threatening, but unmistakably protective. Cross stared at this development with obvious shock. His carefully orchestrated trial was dissolving into something he couldn't control, a community rediscovering its voice and refusing to be silenced by fear. The standoff in the town square stretched taut as a bowstring, with Cross's armed men facing a growing circle of protective townspeople. The mayor's face had gone from red to purple, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the pressure of unexpected resistance. "Stand down!" Cross barked at his gunmen, perhaps realizing that violence against the townspeople would destroy any remaining legitimacy he might claim. "All of you, return to your homes immediately or face charges of interfering with legal proceedings." But the crowd wasn't dispersing. If anything, more people were joining the protective circle around Dr. Harrison, including some faces that surprised Jericho. Thomas Henderson from the livery stable stepped forward, and behind him came Sarah Murphy with her 3 children. Even Deputy Mills had emerged from the jail, his young face troubled as he surveyed the scene. "Mayor Cross," Mills said hesitantly, "perhaps we should postpone these proceedings until proper legal counsel can be arranged. This situation is getting out of hand." "The situation," Cross snarled, "is perfectly under control. Unless you're questioning my authority as well, Deputy." Mills glanced at the protective crowd, at Adelaide standing dignified despite her shackles, at Jericho, who'd done nothing more than help an injured woman. "I'm questioning whether this is justice, sir." It was then that Jericho noticed something glinting in Adelaide's hand. She'd managed to work the compass free from her pocket despite the shackles. The brass caught the morning sunlight as she held it up for the crowd to see. "This compass," Adelaide said, her voice carrying clearly across the square, "belonged to my husband. He used it to survey every inch of this valley, to mark the boundaries that protected this community from land speculators and railroad barons." She turned slowly, the compass in her outstretched hand, pointing to different sections of the town. "Richard surveyed the land where your homes stand, where your businesses operate, where your children play. He filed the legal documents that gave you title to those properties, that ensured the water rights would remain communal, that protected this valley from being carved up and sold to the highest bidder." Cross was staring at the compass with something approaching recognition. "Where did you get that?" he demanded. "It was a wedding gift from Richard's father," Adelaide replied. "A tool for finding true north when you're lost in unfamiliar territory." She looked directly at Cross, just like the town charter was meant to be a moral compass, pointing toward justice when people lost their way. Dr. Harrison opened the journal to another marked page. "There's something else the townspeople should know," he announced. "According to Richard's notes, someone has been altering the official land records at the county office. Properties that were designated as communal lands are being quietly transferred to private ownership." The crowd erupted in angry voices. These were people who'd worked hard to build homes and businesses, who'd believed their investments were secure under the community charter. The idea that their land might be stolen from under them sparked outrage that Cross's rhetoric about progress couldn't contain. "Who?" Michael Murphy demanded. "Who's been stealing our land?" Harrison consulted the journal. "The transfers are being made through a shell company called Mountain Vista Development. The registered owner is—" He paused, meeting Cross's increasingly panicked gaze. "Vernon Cross." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Cross's supporters looked stunned by this revelation. The mayor had been painting himself as a servant of the community while secretly enriching himself at their expense. "Lies," Cross shouted. "More fabrications from desperate people trying to avoid justice." "Then you won't mind if we send someone to the county office to verify the records," Dr. Harrison said calmly. Adelaide stepped forward again, the compass still gleaming in her hand. "There's more you should know about Mr. Cross's vision for Elkhorn Ridge. The railroad contract he's been negotiating doesn't just bring a train through town. It requires the displacement of most existing residents to make way for new development." "That's not true," Cross protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "The surveyor's compass doesn't lie," Adelaide said quietly. "Neither did my husband when he designed this community to protect its people, instead of exploiting them." Maria Santos moved closer to Adelaide, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived in Elkhorn Ridge longer than most. "My family came here when this was just empty valley. Richard Fairmont promised us a place where we could build something lasting, something honest. What has this man promised you except fear and division?" The crowd was murmuring angrily now, and Cross's gunmen were looking increasingly nervous. They'd been hired to intimidate individuals, not face down an entire community. The dynamic of the situation was shifting in ways that made violence seem both more likely and more catastrophic. Deputy Mills stepped forward, his hand resting on his sidearm but not drawing it. Mayor Cross, I think we need to suspend these proceedings pending a full investigation of these allegations. You think? Cross's voice dripped with contempt. You're paid to follow orders, not think. I'm paid to uphold the law, Mills replied, his young voice gaining strength. And nothing about this feels lawful. It was then that one of Cross's hired gunmen made a mistake. Nervous about the crowd's mood and his employer's obvious panic, he drew his weapon, not pointing it at anyone specifically, but making it visible as a threat. The reaction was immediate and electric. Several men in the crowd moved to shield their families, while others stepped forward with the determined expressions of people who'd had enough intimidation. Dr. Harrison raised the journal like a shield, and Maria Santos linked arms with Adelaide in a gesture of solidarity. Jericho, despite his shackles, positioned himself between the gunman and the crowd. Easy, he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. Nobody needs to get hurt here. Stand down, Wade, the gunman snarled. This doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us, Jericho replied. That's what community means. Adelaide raised the compass higher, its brass surface catching the light like a beacon. Richard used to say that true north never changes, no matter how lost you feel. The principles he built into this community, justice, mutual support, shared prosperity, those don't change either. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, neighbors she'd known for years, people who'd shared meals and celebrations and sorrows. You all know who I am. You knew my husband. You know what this town was like before fear took hold. Cross realized he was losing control completely. His carefully planned execution was turning into a community awakening, and the people of Elkhorn Ridge were remembering what they'd once been, and what they could be again. Enough, he shouted, desperation making his voice crack. Guards, end this nonsense now! But as his men moved forward, something remarkable happened. The protective circle around Dr. Harrison and Adelaide expanded, with more townspeople stepping forward to join it. They weren't armed, weren't threatening violence, but they were making it clear that they would no longer stand aside while their neighbors were persecuted. The compass in Adelaide's hand caught the light once more, pointing steadily toward true north, while the community of Elkhorn Ridge rediscovered its moral direction. The tension in the town square had reached a breaking point when Adelaide did something that stunned everyone present. She reached into her dress with her free hand and withdrew a folded document, its edges blackened with soot but still intact. The crowd watched in hushed amazement as she carefully unfolded what appeared to be an official contract. Before anyone does something we'll all regret, Adelaide said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. Perhaps you should see what your mayor has really been planning for Elkhorn Ridge. Cross's face went ashen. Where did you get that? From the same fire that supposedly destroyed all the evidence, Adelaide replied. You were careless, Mr. Cross. You thought you'd burned everything, but this particular document fell behind Richard's desk. I found it when I was salvaging what I could. Dr. Harrison moved closer to examine the document, his eyes widening as he read. This is a railroad contract, he announced to the crowd, signed by Vernon Cross as mayor of Elkhorn Ridge. So? Cross said defensively. I've never hidden my negotiations with the railroad. Progress requires difficult decisions. Difficult decisions, Harrison repeated, continuing to read. Like displacing every family currently living in the town center to make way for a rail yard. Like selling the communal water rights to the railroad company for industrial use. Like relocating the entire population to company housing outside the original town boundaries. The crowd erupted in angry voices. These weren't just changes to their community. This was the complete destruction of everything they'd built. Furthermore, Harrison continued, his voice rising above the commotion, this contract specifies that all displaced residents will become employees of the railroad company. with housing and wages determined at the company's discretion. Slavery, Maria Santos said flatly. You're selling us into slavery. It's economic opportunity, Cross protested. Steady employment, modern housing, integration into the wider economy. At what cost? Thomas Henderson demanded. Our homes, our independence, our right to govern ourselves? Adelaide held up the contract, and even from a distance Jericho could see the dark stains on the paper that weren't from smoke. This contract is signed in blood, she said quietly. Literally. Someone cut their hand to provide the ink for their signature. The crowd fell silent at this revelation. Blood contracts were the stuff of dark legend, associated with deals so binding and terrible that ordinary ink wouldn't suffice. Cross laughed nervously. Superstitious nonsense. It's just a symbolic gesture, showing commitment to the agreement. Whose blood? Dr. Harrison asked, examining the signature more closely. Adelaide's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I believe it's my husband's. The implications of this statement hit the crowd like a physical blow. If Richard Fairmont's blood had been used to sign a contract he never would have agreed to, it could only mean one thing. You're suggesting that Richard was murdered, Cross said with forced calm. That's a serious accusation. I'm not suggesting anything, Adelaide replied. I'm stating a fact. My husband was killed so that his blood could be used to legitimize this contract. Dr. Harrison was studying the document with his medical expertise. The blood appears to have been applied post-mortem, he said grimly. The coagulation patterns are consistent with blood drawn from someone who was already dead. The crowd was backing away from Cross now, horror replacing anger on their faces. This wasn't just corruption or land theft. This was murder committed for the sake of a business deal. This is madness, Cross said, but his voice lacked conviction. You're all listening to the ravings of a grief-stricken widow and a collection of worthless papers. Then explain this, Adelaide said, producing another document from her dress. This one was newer, written in Cross's own handwriting. A letter to the railroad company, dated 3 days before my husband's death, confirming that the obstacle to progress would soon be removed. Cross's composure finally shattered completely. You don't understand the bigger picture. This town was dying. Richard's naive idealism was keeping everyone trapped in poverty and isolation. So you killed him? Jericho said quietly. It wasn't a question. I saved this community, Cross shouted. I brought opportunity, investment, future prosperity. Richard would have kept you all living like primitives in his little socialist paradise. How? Dr. Harrison asked. How did you kill him? Cross was pacing now, his careful politician's mask completely abandoned. It was supposed to look natural, a heart attack in his sleep. Nobody would question it. He'd been working too hard, carrying too much stress. The poison was meant to be undetectable, but you needed his blood for the contract. Adelaide said the railroad company required authentication, proof that the original founder had agreed to the transfer. They're superstitious about these frontier contracts, wanted everything done according to old customs. The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Cross had just confessed to murder in front of the entire town, and the reasons behind it made the crime even more horrific. Deputy Mills stepped forward, his hand on his weapon. Vernon Cross, you're under arrest for the murder of Richard Fairmont. You can't arrest me, Cross snarled. I'm the mayor. I have immunity. You're a murderer, Mills replied steadily. And murderers have no immunity in Elkhorn Ridge. But Cross wasn't finished yet. You still don't understand. This contract is binding whether you like it or not. The railroad is coming through and they have legal title to this land. Fighting me won't change that. Adelaide looked down at the blood-stained document in her hands, then at the compass that had guided her husband's original survey of the valley. Actually, it will change everything, she said softly. She walked to the center of the square, where a rain barrel stood near the gallows. Without hesitation, she dropped the railroad contract into the water, where the blood ink began to dissolve immediately. Blood contracts are only binding as long as the original document exists, she explained as the paper disintegrated. Destroy the contract, and the agreement becomes void. Cross lunged toward the barrel, but Jericho, despite his shackles, managed to block his path. "It's over, Cross." "No!" Cross pulled a derringer from his coat, pointing it wildly at the crowd. "I won't let you destroy everything I've worked for." But his hired gunmen were already backing away, unwilling to fight for a man who'd just confessed to murder. The townspeople closed in around Cross, not threatening but determined, led by Deputy Mills, who kept his own weapon trained on the corrupt mayor. "It's over," Adelaide said gently, as if speaking to a child. "The contract is destroyed, the truth is known, and Richard can finally rest in peace." Cross stared at the rain barrel where the last traces of the blood contract were dissolving into nothing. His grand plan for transforming Elkhorn Ridge lay in ruins, undone by the very documents he'd thought he'd destroyed and the blood he'd spilled to legitimize his scheme. The sun was reaching its zenith as Deputy Mills placed handcuffs on Vernon Cross, and the gallows that had been built to execute the innocent instead awaited someone who truly deserved judgment. The compass in Adelaide's hand pointed steadily toward true north, just as her husband had designed it to do, guiding the community back toward justice and away from the darkness that had nearly consumed them all. With Vernon Cross in handcuffs and his confession echoing in the minds of every witness, the town square of Elkhorn Ridge had transformed from a place of intended execution into something resembling a courtroom where real justice might finally be served. But as the immediate shock of the revelations began to settle, the practical questions of what came next started weighing heavily on everyone present. Dr. Harrison carefully closed Richard Fairmont's journal and approached Adelaide, who stood near the rain barrel where the blood contract had dissolved into harmless ink and water. "The question now," he said quietly, "is how we proceed. Cross may be arrested, but his hired guns are still armed, and the railroad company won't simply abandon their plans because one contract has been destroyed." Adelaide nodded, her weathered hand still clutching the brass compass that had guided her through the darkest moments of this ordeal. "Richard always said that the most dangerous time for any community is the moment when old leadership falls and new leadership hasn't yet been established. That's when fear and confusion can lead good people to make terrible choices." From across the square, the town bell began to ring, not the regular tolling that marked the hours, but the rapid, urgent pealing that had always been used to summon the community in times of crisis. Maria Santos had climbed the church steps and was pulling the rope with determined strength, calling every citizen of Elkhorn Ridge to witness what came next. The sound drew people from their homes and businesses, swelling the crowd beyond those who had witnessed the morning's dramatic revelations. Families emerged with children in tow. Shopkeepers closed their doors to join their neighbors, and even the elderly and infirm made their way to the square to participate in what everyone sensed was a pivotal moment in their community's history. Jericho, still shackled but no longer under guard, since Deputy Mills had transferred his attention to Cross, moved closer to Adelaide. "What happens now?" he asked. "Cross is finished, but he was right about one thing. The railroad won't give up easily. They've invested too much in this plan to walk away without a fight." "Then we'll have to be ready for that fight," Adelaide replied, but her voice carried uncertainty. She was an elderly woman who'd spent months being treated as a pariah in her own community. The idea of leading a resistance against powerful business interests seemed almost impossible. Dr. Harrison overheard their conversation and joined them. "There's something else we need to consider," he said, lowering his voice. "Cross mentioned that his plans had backing from territorial authorities. Even if we can prove his guilt in Richard's murder, there may be legal challenges to our right to govern ourselves." Deputy Mills approached their small group, his young face serious with new responsibility. "I've sent word to the territorial marshal about Cross's confession, but it'll be days before any official help arrives. In the meantime, we need to decide what authority governs this town." Adelaide looked around at the growing crowd of townspeople. Faces she'd known for years, people who'd shared the struggles and triumphs of building a life in this harsh but beautiful valley. Many of them were looking to her with something approaching hope, as if her survival of Cross's persecution had made her a symbol of their community's resilience. "The authority comes from them," she said, indicating the assembled citizens. "That's what Richard always believed, that legitimate government derives from the consent of the governed." Maria Santos finished ringing the bell and made her way down from the church steps, joining the circle of community leaders that was spontaneously forming around Adelaide. "The people are ready to listen," she announced, "but they need to know what we're asking them to choose between." Thomas Henderson from the livery stable stepped forward, his weathered hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said to Adelaide, "some of us remember the early days when your husband ran things. There was fairness then, and prosperity too. Not the kind Cross promised, built on other people's misery, but honest prosperity from honest work. And some of us are newer to town," added Sarah Murphy from the general store. "We came here because we heard Elkhorn Ridge was different from other frontier communities, that it was a place where families could build something lasting." Adelaide felt the weight of their expectations, the hope in their voices, and the magnitude of what they were asking her to help them rebuild. "I'm not my husband," she said quietly. "I don't have his skills as a leader, his knowledge of law and surveying and business. But you have something else," Dr. Harrison said. "You have his compass. You know true north." The crowd had arranged itself in a rough circle around the small group of speakers, and Jericho could see the dynamics of a genuine democratic assembly beginning to emerge. People were talking among themselves, sharing opinions and concerns, gradually working toward consensus rather than being told what to think by authority figures. "What about the railroad?" called out James Wheeler, who ran the blacksmith shop. "Even if we reject Cross's deal, they still want this valley for their route. They have money, lawyers, political connections. What do we have?" Adelaide held up the compass and Richard's journal, then gestured toward the faces surrounding them. "We have the truth. We have legal documents proving our right to this land. And we have something no amount of money can buy. We have each other." Deputy Mills cleared his throat. "There's something else you should know. When I searched Cross's office, I found correspondence with the railroad company. They're expecting a final answer on the contract within the week. If we don't respond, they plan to proceed with what they call alternative arrangements." "What kind of alternative arrangements?" Maria asked. "Forced buyouts, legal challenges to our land titles, potentially even federal intervention, if they can convince territorial authorities that we're interfering with interstate commerce." The crowd stirred uneasily at this news. They were simple people, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, not equipped to fight powerful corporate interests in courtrooms and legislative halls. "Then we need to be smart about this," Adelaide said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "We need to use the law to protect ourselves, the same way Richard did when he founded this community." Dr. Harrison opened the journal to a section he'd marked earlier. Richard's notes include detailed correspondence with territorial officials about the legal status of cooperative communities. "There are protections under territorial law for established settlements, especially those with proper documentation. But we'll need help," Adelaide admitted. "Legal representation, political allies, people who understand how to fight this kind of battle. I might know someone," Jericho said quietly, drawing surprised looks from the others. It was the first time he'd suggested any connections outside Elkhorn Ridge. "There's a lawyer in Denver, specializes in land rights and territorial law. Name's Benjamin Hartwell. If he's still practicing, he might be willing to help. You know him?" Dr. Harrison asked. Jericho hesitated, and Adelaide could see that he was weighing how much of his past to reveal. "We served together during the war. He saved my life once. I figure that's worth calling in a favor." The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the square, and the practical urgency of their situation was becoming clear to everyone present. They had perhaps a week to organize their response to the railroad company, to establish legitimate governance to replace Cross's corrupt administration, and to prepare for what might be a protracted legal and political battle. Adelaide looked down at the compass in her palm. its needle pointing steadily toward magnetic north, just as it had when Richard used it to survey their valley all those years ago. "Then we'd better get started," she said. The dawn of the seventh day arrived with an ominous rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. As the first light crept across Elkhorn Ridge, residents emerged from their homes to see a sight that chilled them to the bone: a locomotive approaching from the eastern pass, black smoke billowing from its stack like a harbinger of destruction. Behind it came 3 passenger cars filled with men in expensive suits, and 2 freight cars that everyone hoped contained only legal documents and surveying equipment. Adelaide stood on the porch of her small blue house. The hangman's noose that had been intended for her execution now coiled in her hands like a symbol of justice reclaimed. She'd spent the week helping to organize the town's resistance, working with Dr. Harrison to document their legal claims, and with Deputy Mills to establish legitimate governance. But none of their preparation had anticipated the railroad arriving in force a full day ahead of schedule. Jericho appeared at her gate, moving with the purposeful stride of a man who'd made peace with whatever was coming. His telegram to Benjamin Hartwell had received no response, and the week of waiting had given the community time to organize but also time to worry. Now that the moment of confrontation had arrived, there was a strange sense of relief mixed with the fear. "They're early," Adelaide observed, watching the train slow as it approached the makeshift platform that served Elkhorn Ridge's modest station. "They're trying to catch us off guard," Jericho replied. "Standard military tactic: arrive when your enemy isn't expecting you." From the train's passenger cars, men began emerging with the confident bearing of people accustomed to getting their way. Adelaide recognized the type immediately: railroad executives, territorial officials, lawyers armed with briefcases full of legal papers designed to overwhelm and intimidate simple frontier folk. Leading the group was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a coat that probably cost more than most Elkhorn Ridge families earned in a month. He surveyed the town with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating property for purchase, his pale eyes taking in the modest buildings and dusty streets with obvious disappointment. Dr. Harrison hurried up the street from his office, Richard Fairmont's journal tucked securely under his arm. "They've brought at least 20 men," he reported breathlessly. "Some of them look like lawyers, but others," he shook his head grimly, "others look like the kind of men you hire when legal methods aren't enough." Maria Santos emerged from her cantina, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd spent the early morning preparing food for what everyone hoped would be a peaceful resolution, but feared might become something else entirely. "The town bell is ready," she told Adelaide. "One ring if we need to call the people together, 3 rings if—" She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. 3 rings meant danger, meant the community was under attack. The railroad delegation made its way up Main Street with theatrical precision, their expensive boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. Behind them came men carrying surveying equipment and what appeared to be official documentation. At the rear of the group, several individuals kept their hands near concealed weapons, their eyes constantly scanning for potential threats. Adelaide stepped down from her porch, the noose still in her hands, and walked to meet them in the center of the street. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. An elderly woman with a hangman's rope facing down the forces of corporate power and political corruption. "Gentlemen," she said when they were close enough for conversation, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "welcome to Elkhorn Ridge. I'm Adelaide Fairmont." The silver-haired leader stopped a few paces away, his expression showing mild surprise at being greeted by an elderly woman rather than cowering townspeople. "Mrs. Fairmont, I'm Harrison Blackwood, Regional Director for the Mountain Pacific Railroad. We believe you have something that belongs to us." "I'm not sure what you mean," Adelaide replied calmly. Blackwood gestured to one of his lawyers, who opened a briefcase and withdrew a stack of official-looking papers. "We have here a legally binding contract for the purchase of this entire valley, signed by the duly elected mayor of Elkhorn Ridge and authenticated according to territorial law." "You mean this contract?" Adelaide held up the noose, and Blackwood's eyes widened as he recognized what it represented. "The one signed in blood taken from my murdered husband?" "That's a serious accusation," Blackwood said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. Dr. Harrison stepped forward, opening Richard's journal to a marked page. "It's also a documented fact. We have Vernon Cross's confession to the murder of Richard Fairmont, witnessed by over 50 townspeople. Confessions obtained under duress have no legal standing," one of the lawyers interjected. "Neither do contracts signed with blood taken from murder victims," Adelaide replied quietly. The morning air seemed to grow thicker as the two sides faced each other in the dusty street. Behind the railroad men, more townspeople were gathering, families emerging from their homes, business owners closing their shops to stand with their neighbors. The community that had been divided and frightened under Cross's rule was presenting a united front. Blackwood studied the growing crowd with calculating eyes, clearly reassessing his assumptions about what this confrontation would involve. "Mrs. Fairmont," he said finally, "I think there may be some misunderstanding about the situation here. Perhaps we should discuss this matter privately." "There's no misunderstanding," Adelaide replied, raising the noose higher so everyone could see it. "And there's nothing private about murder and theft. Everything that needs to be said can be said in front of the people whose lives you're trying to destroy." The railroad director's composure cracked slightly, and his hand moved toward his coat pocket. But before he could draw whatever he'd concealed there, the clear, strong voice of Maria Santos rang across the square. "Ring the bell!" The bronze bell's voice cut through the morning air like a clarion call, its resonant tones echoing off the surrounding hills and drawing every resident of Elkhorn Ridge toward the confrontation unfolding in their town's heart. As the sound waves rippled outward, something remarkable happened. Doors opened throughout the valley, and people emerged not in fear but in determination. Harrison Blackwood's, and froze halfway to his coat pocket as he realized that what he'd expected to be a simple intimidation of a few troublemakers had become something entirely different. The street was filling with townspeople, men, women, children, and elders, all moving with the purposeful unity of a community that had rediscovered its strength. Adelaide stood at the center of it all, the hangman's noose held high like a banner of defiance, while Dr. Harrison moved beside her with Richard Fairmont's journal open, to display the founding documents that proved their legal right to exist as a free community. "Mr. Blackwood," Adelaide said, her voice carrying clearly as the bell's final echoes faded, "I believe you were about to threaten us. Please continue. Let everyone hear what the railroad's idea of negotiation sounds like." Blackwood looked around at the growing crowd, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized he was vastly outnumbered. His hired enforcers shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of using violence against an entire community that included families with young children. "There's no need for threats," Blackwood said, attempting to regain his composure. "We're here to complete a legal transaction. Nothing more. A transaction based on murder," Maria Santos called out from the crowd, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who'd helped hold the community together through its darkest days. "Alleged murder," one of Blackwood's lawyers corrected. "And even if such allegations were true, they wouldn't invalidate a properly executed contract." Deputy Mills stepped forward, his badge catching the morning sunlight. "The contract was destroyed," he announced. "Dissolved in water after it was determined to be fraudulent. Then we'll simply execute a new one," Blackwood replied smoothly. "With proper legal representation for all parties, of course." "With whom?" Dr. Harrison asked, holding up Richard's journal. "According to territorial law, municipal contracts require the signature of a duly elected mayor. Vernon Cross was never legitimately elected. His victory was obtained through fraud and intimidation." Adelaide moved closer to Blackwood, the noose in her hands serving as a stark reminder of how close their community had come to complete destruction. "Moreover," she said quietly. Even if Cross had been legitimately elected, he had no authority to sell communal lands that were designated as community property under the original territorial grants. Those grants can be challenged in territorial court, Blackwood said. But his voice lacked conviction. They already have been, a new voice called from the edge of the crowd. Everyone turned to see a man in a dusty traveling coat, dismounting from a horse that showed signs of hard riding. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to courtrooms and legal battles. Jericho stepped forward with obvious relief. "Benjamin Hartwell," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd gotten my message." "Your telegram found me in Denver," Hartwell replied, moving through the crowd with a lawyer's instinct for dramatic timing. "I've spent the past 3 days reviewing the territorial records regarding Elkhorn Ridge, and I have some interesting news for Mr. Blackwood and his associates." Hartwell opened his satchel and withdrew a thick folder of legal documents. "The land grants for this valley were filed under the Homestead Cooperation Act of 1862, which specifically protects communities organized as cooperative ventures from forced sale or dissolution." Blackwood's face had gone pale. "That act applies only to agricultural cooperatives. Elkhorn Ridge was established as a mixed agricultural and commercial cooperative," Hartwell continued, consulting his documents. "The original filings are quite specific on this point. Furthermore, the territorial government has no record of any legitimate contract transferring these lands to railroad interests." Adelaide felt a surge of vindication as she watched Blackwood's legal advantage crumble before the weight of actual law and proper documentation. "It seems your confidence was misplaced, Mr. Blackwood." But Blackwood wasn't finished yet. His hand moved to his coat again, and this time he completed the motion, drawing a small but efficient pistol that he pointed directly at Adelaide. "Enough!" he snarled, his corporate mask finally slipping to reveal the ruthless man beneath. "Legal niceties aside, this valley is too valuable to leave in the hands of a collection of farmers and shopkeepers. The railroad will come through here whether you agree or not." The crowd collectively drew back, but Adelaide stood her ground, the noose still raised in her hands. "And there it is," she said calmly. "The truth behind all the legal documents and business contracts. When law doesn't serve your purposes, you simply resort to violence." Jericho moved with the fluid grace of a trained soldier, positioning himself between Blackwood's gun and Adelaide. "You're outnumbered 20-1, he said quietly. "How do you think this ends?" "It ends with this community learning the cost of defying progress," Blackwood replied, but his voice betrayed uncertainty. That's when Adelaide did something that no one expected. She walked directly toward Blackwood, the noose held out before her like an offering. "This rope was meant to hang me for the crime of accepting help when I needed it," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "It was built by fear and hatred and greed. But now it represents something different. It represents the choice every community faces between justice and tyranny." She stopped just beyond arm's reach of Blackwood's gun. "So choose, Mr. Blackwood. Shoot an unarmed elderly woman in front of 50 witnesses, or accept that some things can't be bought or stolen or murdered into submission." The founder's gavel appeared in Dr. Harrison's hands. Richard Fairmont's ceremonial gavel that had been used to conduct town meetings and make official decisions. He raised it high above his head, its wooden surface catching the morning light. "By the authority vested in the people of Elkhorn Ridge," Harrison declared, "I hereby strip all recognition from the fraudulent administration of Vernon Cross and restore legitimate governance to this community." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the valley, and in that moment everything changed. 3 months had passed since the sound of Richard Fairmont's gavel echoed across Elkhorn Ridge, and the valley had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The morning sun now illuminated a community that had rediscovered its soul, where the principles of mutual support and shared prosperity once again guided daily life. Adelaide sat on her front porch, the same blue house with its white picket fence, but everything about it spoke of renewal. The garden bloomed with vegetables and flowers, tended by neighbors who had remembered what it meant to care for one another. The loose boards had been repaired, the paint refreshed, and the roof made sound. Against winter weather that would come soon enough, in her lap lay a new document, carefully written on parchment, and signed by every adult resident of Elkhorn Ridge. It was a new town charter, incorporating the lessons learned from their recent trials while honoring the vision that Richard Fairmont had established decades ago. This charter explicitly protected individual rights while strengthening community bonds, and it contained provisions designed to prevent any future Vernon Cross from seizing power through fear and manipulation. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up to see Jericho Wade walking up her garden path. He moved with the same quiet confidence he'd always possessed, but there was something different about him now, a sense of belonging that hadn't been there when he'd first arrived as a mysterious stranger with a lame horse. "Morning, Adelaide," he said, settling into the chair beside her on the porch. "How are you feeling about today?" Adelaide smiled, her weathered hands smoothing the charter's pages. Nervous, hopeful, grateful, she looked out over the town where preparations were underway for the day's ceremony. "Richard would be proud, I think." Today marked the official signing of the new charter, but more importantly, it marked the election of Elkhorn Ridge's new leadership. The democratic process that Richard Fairmont had designed into the original community structure was finally being fully realized, with every citizen having a voice in choosing their future. Dr. Harrison emerged from his office, medical bag in one hand and a folder of documents in the other. At 72, he'd been elected as the town's new mayor by unanimous vote, his years of quiet service and moral courage making him the obvious choice to guide Elkhorn Ridge into its next chapter. "The territorial representatives have arrived," he announced, settling into a third chair that had been placed on the porch in anticipation of this moment, including Federal Marshal Thompson, who's here to witness Cross's confession and take him back to Denver for trial. Vernon Cross had spent the past 3 months in the town jail, a broken man whose grandiose dreams of power and wealth had crumbled into charges of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. His hired gunmen had fled the moment Harrison Blackwood was arrested, unwilling to face federal charges for their employer's crimes. "And Blackwood?" Jericho asked, "being transported under federal guard. Turns out the Mountain Pacific Railroad has quite a history of illegal land acquisitions and intimidating local communities. The territorial government is very interested in his business practices." Harrison opened his folder and withdrew a letter bearing official seals. "We also received final confirmation from the Territorial Land Office. All our original grants are valid and properly filed. Elkhorn Ridge's legal status as a cooperative community is unquestioned." Adelaide looked down at the charter in her hands, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A simple act of kindness, helping a fallen neighbor, had nearly cost Jericho his life and had certainly cost her months of exile and persecution. But it had also awakened something in their community that had been dormant too long. "There's something else," Harrison continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "The territorial governor wants to use Elkhorn Ridge as a model for other frontier communities. He's asked if we'd be willing to share our charter and governance structure with towns facing similar challenges." "What did you tell him?" Jericho asked. "That we'd be honored to help our neighbors, but only if they truly want what we have, not if they're being forced to accept it." Harrison smiled. "After all, democracy only works when people choose it freely." Maria Santos appeared at the garden gate, her arms full of fresh bread and her face bright with the satisfaction of someone who'd played a crucial role in her community's salvation. "The food is ready for the celebration," she announced, "and Father Miguel has arrived from Santa Fe to bless the new charter." As they prepared to walk to the town square for the ceremony, Adelaide reached into her dress pocket and withdrew the brass compass that had guided her through the darkest days of the crisis. The instrument gleamed in the morning sunlight, its needle pointing steadily toward magnetic north, just as it had when Richard used it to survey their valley. "Jericho," she said, holding out the compass, "I want you to have this." He looked surprised. "Adelaide, that belonged to your husband. It should stay with you. Richard always said that a compass is only valuable if it helps people find their way," she replied. "You helped us find our way back to ourselves. This belongs with someone who understands the importance of true north." Jericho accepted the compass with reverence, understanding the weight of trust and responsibility it represented. "I'll take good care of it. I know you will. And someday, when you meet someone else who's lost their way, you'll know what to do." As they walked toward the town square, where the entire community was gathering to celebrate their new beginning, Adelaide reflected on the lessons learned from their ordeal. She thought about the power of standing up for what's right, even when it seems hopeless. About the strength that comes from neighbors supporting each other in times of crisis. About the truth that justice delayed is not always justice denied, especially when good people refuse to give up fighting for it. The bronze bell began to ring, not the urgent call to crisis that had summoned them months ago, but the joyful pealing that announced celebration and renewal. Children ran between the adults, their laughter mixing with the conversations of families who no longer had to fear their neighbors or doubt their future. In the center of the square, a simple wooden platform had been erected where the gallows once stood. On it sat a table bearing the new charter, waiting for the signatures that would make Elkhorn Ridge's rebirth official. As Jericho held the compass and watched Adelaide prepare to sign the document that would secure their community's future, he realized that his own journey had come full circle. He'd arrived in Elkhorn Ridge as a man running from his past, seeking nothing more than temporary shelter. He was staying as someone who'd found his purpose in protecting and serving others. The compass needle swung gently in his palm, settling on true north, just as the community of Elkhorn Ridge had found its moral direction again. Sometimes, he reflected, helping a stranger really was the most dangerous thing you could do. Dangerous to tyranny, dangerous to injustice, and dangerous to the forces that would turn neighbors into enemies. But it was also the most necessary thing, the choice that separated civilization from barbarism, the act that proved that kindness and courage could triumph over fear and greed when good people decided to stand together. The signing ceremony began with Father Miguel's blessing, and Elkhorn Ridge officially entered its new era, one founded not on the dreams of any single individual, but on the collective wisdom of a community that had learned to value justice above profit, compassion above convenience, and truth above all.